Hello friends, welcome back to my channel. If you like scary stories, hit subscribe, like the video, and share with your friends. Thanks. I had been walking all day through the thick woods, trying to find a quiet spot to set up camp. The sky had been gray since noon, but I didn't think much about it. I was deep in the forest now, far from the main trails, and the quiet was heavy. I liked it, though. It was just me, the trees, and the sound of my boots on the damp ground. By the time I found a good place to set up my tent, it was late in the afternoon. I put the tent up fast, just as the first few drops of rain started to fall. At first, it was just a light sprinkle, nothing too bad. But as the hours went by, the rain got heavier. I could hear it hitting the tent in a steady beat, a sound that blocked out everything else. The woods felt alive, but in a way that made me nervous. The rain didn't just fall. It felt like it was pushing down on everything, making the forest feel smaller, tighter. Inside the tent, I lay in my sleeping bag trying to keep warm. The air was cold and wet, and I could see my breath in the weak light from my headlamp. I listened to the rain, but underneath it, I thought I heard something else. A soft rustling, like something moving between the trees. At first, I brushed it off, thinking it was just the wind or some animal. But the sound didn't go away. It came back, again and again, and the more I listened, the more I realized it wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal either. It was something moving slow, careful, and it was getting closer. I sat up, my heart thumping hard in my chest. The rain had picked up, and now it was coming down in thick sheets, making it hard to hear or see anything outside the tent. I unzipped the tent flap just a little and looked out. Nothing, just darkness and rain. But then I heard it again. Footsteps. Slow, careful footsteps, just barely loud enough to hear over the rain. My mind started to race. Maybe it was a deer or even a bear, but something about it didn't sit right with me. It sounded human. I grabbed my flashlight and turned it on, pointing it into the trees. The beam of light cut through the rain, lighting up the thick branches and wet leaves. At first, I saw nothing but rain and mist swirling in the air. Then something moved. Something big darted behind a tree, too fast for me to get a good look at. But it was there. Someone was out there watching me. Panic hit me hard. I swept the flashlight back and forth, trying to see, but the rain made everything look blurry. I wanted to run, but where would I go? I was deep in the woods, miles from the closest road, and in the dark, with the rain coming down this hard, there was no way I'd find the trail back. I turned off the flashlight, hoping the darkness would hide me. The rain kept pounding, and the footsteps stopped. For a moment, everything was quiet. Then, a loud crack, like a branch snapping, right outside my tent. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. The tent felt paper thin, like it could be torn open at any second. I sat there, holding my breath, waiting. The rain was so loud now that I couldn't hear anything else. Minutes passed, or maybe it was hours. Couldn't tell. The snapping and rustling faded, and soon it was just the sound of the rain again. I stayed still, my heart racing in my chest. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep, even though I didn't mean to. When I woke up, it was early morning. The rain had slowed to a light drizzle, and the sky was starting to brighten up a little. I unzipped the tent slowly and stepped outside. The ground was soaked, the air was thick with fog, and everything around me was quiet. But then I saw them. Footprints. Large human footprints, deep in the mud, circling around my tent. They weren't mine. I hadn't walked there. Someone had been right outside while I slept. The tracks led away from my tent and into the trees, disappearing into the fog. I packed up fast, my hands shaking the whole time. I didn't even bother to eat breakfast. I just wanted to get out of there. As I hiked back through the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made me jump. But I didn't see anyone. Hours later, I finally made it back to the main trail. I felt a small bit of relief as I reached the edge of the woods, but it didn't last long. As I looked back at the dark line of trees behind me, something hit me that I couldn't ignore. Those footprints didn't look like they had come from just one person. There had been too many tracks, all in different directions, like someone or several people had been moving around my tent for hours, watching, waiting. And now, as I stood there on the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't gone. They were still out there, hidden in the trees, watching me leave. I wondered if they were waiting for someone else to camp there next. We decided to go camping deep in the jungle, somewhere in the forests of South America. My sister and her best friends had been talking about it for weeks, and after some hesitation, I agreed to go along. The plan was simple: hike a few miles into the thick forest, set up camp, and spend the night under the stars. It sounded fun, something different, something exciting. First, the hike was great. The jungle was full of life. Birds calling, leaves rustling, and bugs buzzing everywhere. The air was heavy and hot, but the shade from the trees made it easier to deal with. We kept walking deeper into the forest, far from any roads or people. Felt like we were in a completely different world. By the time we found a good spot to camp, it was late afternoon. We picked a place near a small stream, surrounded by tall trees that seemed to close us off from everything else. Felt isolated, quiet, too quiet. But we were all tired from the long hike, so we quickly set up the tents and started a small fire. When the sun finally went down, the mood shifted. The jungle sounds, which had been lively and constant, started to change. It wasn't just the usual bugs and birds anymore. It got quieter, except for the occasional snap of a twig or rustle in the darkness. Something about the air felt heavier, like the whole forest was watching us. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I kept glancing around, searching the trees, expecting to see something or someone, but there was nothing there, just darkness. My sister and her friends didn't seem worried, though. They sat around the fire, quietly laughing and talking. But I couldn't relax. There was a gnawing feeling in my gut, a sense that something wasn't right. When it got late, we crawled into our tents. I tried to sleep, but every little sound outside kept me wide awake. The bugs buzzing, the leaves rustling in the wind, distant howls. I couldn't tell if they were from animals or something else. Each sound felt too close, like it was right outside. My heart raced as I listened to the jungle, my mind spinning with worry. Sometime in the middle of the night, I heard something that made my blood run cold. Footsteps. Slow, steady, moving around the edge of our camp. I lay frozen, barely breathing, listening to the sound of those steps circling us. They didn't come too close, but they were close enough to let me know something or someone was out there. I wanted to move, to look outside, but my body refused to cooperate. I just lay there, hoping the footsteps would stop. They didn't. They kept going, walking around us for what felt like hours. It was like whoever or whatever was making them wanted us to know they were there, but didn't want to show themselves just yet. I couldn't tell if it was an animal or a person. It stayed hidden in the dark, always just out of sight. Finally, after what felt like forever, the sound stopped. The jungle slowly came back to life with the familiar noises of the night. I must have passed out from pure exhaustion, because the next thing I knew, I woke up and it was still dark. I listened carefully for the stream, the bugs, anything familiar, but instead, I heard something else, heavy breathing. I turned my head slowly toward my sister's tent. The flap was wide open, and she was gone. So were her friends. My heart sank. I rushed out of my tent, hoping they were just nearby, but the campsite was empty. I called their names, searching the area in a panic, but there was no trace of them. Their backpacks were still there. Their sleeping bags hadn't even been touched. They were just gone. I noticed a trail of faint footprints leading into the trees. They looked like human footprints, but something about them didn't seem right. They were too big, too deep, as if something much heavier than any of us had made them. I thought about following them, but fear kept me rooted to the spot. I couldn't bring myself to step into that darkness. Instead, I sat by the fire, waiting, hoping they would come back, but they never did. As the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I packed up what I could and headed back the way we had come. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know what had taken them. I just walked as fast as I could until I found my way out of the jungle. I told people what had happened, but no one believed me. They searched for weeks, combing through the jungle, but they didn't find a single clue. My sister and her friends were gone, just like that, without a trace. It was like the forest had swallowed them whole. I've never gone back to that place, and I never will. Something lives in those woods, something that watches, waits, and takes people when they least expect it. And once it takes them, they never come back. Whatever it is, it's still out there, hiding in the trees, waiting for its next victim. And I know it's just a matter of time before it finds another group of campers. Maybe next time they won't be so lucky. Maybe next time it won't leave anyone to tell the story. I didn't really know my neighbor that well. He was an old man who mostly kept to himself. I knew he had been divorced for a long time, but he and his ex-wife still saw each other from time to time. He wasn't the kind of person you'd think would go camping, but one day, out of nowhere, he asked if I wanted to join him on a camping trip. I didn't have anything else going on, so I agreed, figuring it would be a quiet trip. Maybe I'd get to know him better. We drove out to a spot way out in the woods, farther than I'd ever been. He said it was a place he and his ex-wife used to go camping, far from any trails or people. It was just the two of us, setting up our tents near a small open area by a lake. The first day wasn't anything special. We put up our tents and gathered some firewood. The old man didn't talk much. He seemed off, always staring at the trees or down at the lake, like he was lost in thought. That night, after we'd been sitting by the fire for a while, I heard a soft noise. It sounded like someone walking through the bushes, but it was too far away for me to see anything. The old man didn't seem to notice it at all. He just kept staring into the flames. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was probably an animal, and eventually went to bed. The next morning, the old man was gone. His tent was still there, and all his stuff was untouched, but he was nowhere to be found. I waited for a few hours, thinking maybe he'd gone for a walk or something. But as time passed and he didn't come back, I started to worry. I looked around the area, calling out for him, but there was no response. The woods were dead silent. The lake was completely still. It was unsettling how everything felt frozen. By the time evening came, I was pacing around the camp, not sure what to do. I thought about leaving, but I didn't know the way back without him. As the sun started to go down, I heard that noise again, the sound of something moving through the brush. This time it was closer. I stood still, listening. It wasn't just one sound anymore. It sounded like two sets of footsteps, slow and steady, coming through the trees. I moved back toward the fire, my eyes locked on the dark woods. The footsteps stopped just past the tree line, and then everything went quiet again. No wind, no birds, nothing. A cold chill ran down my back, like I was being watched. I turned to grab my things, ready to leave, but then I saw something by the edge of the lake. It was a woman standing by the water, her back to me. She wasn't moving, just staring out at the lake. My heart started pounding, and I took a small step toward her, but something felt off. I looked down at the ground, and that's when I saw the second set of footprints leading to where she stood. They were the old man's footprints. I didn't wait to figure out what was going on. I grabbed my stuff and started hiking, not even knowing where I was headed. All I knew was I had to get away from that camp. I walked all night, not stopping until the sun started to rise and I finally found the road. I never saw my neighbor again after that trip. A few weeks later, his ex-wife came by his house, asking if I had heard from him. I didn't tell her what happened. There wasn't really any way to explain it that made sense. The whole thing felt wrong, like I had seen something I wasn't supposed to. Sometimes, late at night, I still think about that trip. I wonder what really happened to him out there. I wonder if he ever left those woods, or if maybe he's still out there walking by the lake with her. I was part of a special army unit set up to gather information on a criminal group suspected of smuggling drugs across the border. We had been told they often camped deep in the woods, hidden from view. After days of watching their movements, we finally got the go-ahead for our operation. As the sun started to set, we parked our vehicles a few miles away and began walking, each step crunching softly on the dry leaves and twigs beneath our boots. The air was cool, and a light breeze rustled the leaves above us. The forest felt thick and heavy, almost as if it was holding its breath. The deeper we went, the more isolated it felt, like we were stepping into another world altogether. We reached the spot we had been given, a small clearing with signs of a campfire and a few tents scattered around. We spread out, keeping watch over everything. I crouched behind a tree, scanning the area with my night vision goggles. A shiver went down my spine as I noticed movement in the shadows. A figure was coming out of one of the tents, holding something shiny that caught the moonlight. My heart raced. I signaled to my team, and we adjusted our positions, ready for anything. The figure turned, and I could see that it was a tall, strong man dressed in dark clothes. He looked alert, scanning the area like he sensed we were there. I could see other men in the distance, gathered around the fire, laughing and drinking. This was their camp. I focused on the man, who began walking around the edge of the clearing, checking for anything out of place. Suddenly, he stopped and stared directly at me. I held my breath, praying he wouldn't come any closer. Then, out of nowhere, a loud snap of a twig echoed through the trees. The man's head whipped around, startled. I knew that sound came from one of my team members who had stepped back too carelessly. In an instant, all hell broke loose. The man yelled a warning, and the rest of his crew jumped to their feet. I could see their faces, hard and rough, as if they had lived their whole lives on the edge of danger. I had trained for this, but nothing could prepare me for the real thing. Adrenaline flooded through me as we moved together, getting ready to engage. We rushed in, but the criminals were faster than I had expected. A gunshot rang out, and I felt a wave of panic as I ducked behind a tree. The night exploded into chaos. Gunfire filled the air along with shouts. I couldn't afford to hesitate. I pushed forward, taking cover as I moved toward the fire. In the middle of the chaos, I spotted a big bag near the flames. I rushed toward it, knowing it probably held evidence of their crimes. Bullets zipped past me, and I felt one graze my arm, sending pain shooting through me. Ignoring it, I dove for the bag, grabbing it just as a group of men rushed toward me. I scrambled to my feet, clutching the bag tightly as I sprinted back to my team. As we regrouped, I felt the weight of what I had in my hands. Drugs and cash, enough to take down their operation for good. We made a quick retreat, moving through the trees as the gunfire continued behind us. Finally, we reached our vehicles and jumped inside, the engine roaring to life as we sped away from the madness. Once we were back at our base, the adrenaline slowly faded, replaced by the harsh reality of what we had faced. I glanced down at the bag in my lap, the proof of our encounter. We had successfully interrupted a dangerous operation, and even though the night had been terrifying, we had made it back alive, holding valuable evidence that could lead to more arrests. The throbbing pain from my injury reminded me of how close I had come to disaster, but I dismissed it as a small price to pay. We had done our job, and in that moment, a mix of relief and pride washed over me. We were soldiers, trained for moments like this, and tonight we had shown we could handle anything the darkness threw our way. But as I sat in the quiet of the base, my mind raced back to the camp. I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't just disrupted an operation. We had stirred something darker. I could almost hear their laughter echoing in my mind, the way it had felt like a trap, luring us deeper into their territory. What if this wasn't over? What if they came looking for revenge? The woods weren't just filled with trees and shadows. They held secrets, and we had stepped into a world that was far from safe. I felt a chill crawl up my spine, knowing that out there in the darkness, the criminals were waiting. They wouldn't forget us. They wouldn't let this go. And as I tried to rest, I realized that the real terror might not be what we had faced, but what was still to come. The haunting thoughts settled in my mind. In the end, the darkness always takes its due. I've always liked the woods, ever since I was a kid. So, when I turned 40, I thought camping alone deep in the forest would help clear my mind. No phone, no people, just me and the trees. I had camped a lot before, but this time I wanted to go farther into the woods than I ever had before. I found a spot far from any trail. There was no one around for miles, just trees as far as I could see. I set up my tent, started a small fire, and spent the afternoon relaxing. Felt good to be away from everything, no distractions, just quiet. I liked that. It felt peaceful, even though I was completely alone. As night came, the air got cold fast. The woods were much darker than I expected. Not a single moon or star in sight, just complete blackness. The only light came from my small fire, and everything beyond that seemed to disappear into the dark. I crawled into my tent when the fire died down, feeling the cold creeping in. Wrapped in my sleeping bag, I listened to the usual forest noises. The wind in the trees, the snap of branches, animals in the distance. But after a while, I heard something else. At first, it was faint, like footsteps, slow and careful. They sounded close. I unzipped my tent and peeked outside, but there was nothing there, just darkness. I told myself it was probably nothing, maybe a deer or something, but it didn't feel right. Then the footsteps came back. This time they were louder, circling the tent. These weren't quick little steps like an animal would make. They were heavy, slow. I stayed still, trying to hear more clearly, hoping it would stop, but it didn't. I grabbed my headlamp and shined it around, but it barely lit anything beyond the trees. The footsteps kept circling my camp, always staying just outside the light's reach. Whatever it was, it knew exactly how far away to stay, like it was watching me. I didn't sleep that night. Every time the footsteps got closer, I'd sit up, trying to figure out where they were coming from. It felt like something was playing with me, teasing me, daring me to come out. I thought about packing up and leaving right then, but it was too dark, and the cold had already settled deep into my bones. By the time morning came, the sounds were gone. The forest looked normal again, but I didn't feel normal. I packed up quickly, wanting to get out of there as soon as I could. As I walked, the trees seemed to press in closer, making me feel like I was being watched. I couldn't shake the feeling, so I kept looking over my shoulder, but there was nothing there. When I finally got to my car, I let out a breath, feeling a little safer. But something made me look back at the trail one last time. That's when I saw them, footprints in the dirt. Deep, spaced apart, definitely human. But they weren't mine. They had circled my camp, just like I thought. I never went camping alone again after that. I don't know what was out there that night, but it knew I was there. It followed me, watched me, and when I left, I wasn't alone. That's the worst part. Whatever was out there, it might still be waiting. I've always liked camping. Last summer, I decided I needed a break from everything. The noise, work, and people. I wanted peace and quiet, so I found a spot deep in the woods, far from any trails or campsites. It was the perfect place to be alone. I knew I wouldn't run into anyone for days, and that was exactly what I wanted. The first day was great. The sun was warm, and I spent the day setting up my tent, gathering wood for a fire, and walking through the woods. By the time it got dark, I had a fire going and everything was set. The forest was calm, except for some noises here and there, probably just animals. I didn't think much of it. I've camped enough to know what the woods sound like at night, but by the second night, something felt wrong. I couldn't explain it, but I had this weird feeling like I wasn't alone anymore. It wasn't like I heard anything loud or saw something. It was just this feeling creeping over me, like something wasn't right. Every time I looked into the dark trees, I thought I saw something move, just out of the corner of my eye. I tried to ignore it, telling myself I was being paranoid, and eventually forced myself to go to sleep. The next morning, though, I saw something that made my heart race. There were footprints in the dirt around my camp. They weren't mine. They were bigger, and there were more than one set, like someone had been walking around while I slept. I looked around but saw no one. I told myself it could have been a hiker passing through, though I knew deep down that didn't make sense. I was too far out for that. Even though I felt uneasy, I decided to stay one more night. As the sun went down and the shadows grew longer, that feeling of being watched came back even stronger. I sat by the fire, trying to focus on other things, but I couldn't shake the feeling. The noises in the woods seemed to get closer, and the silence between them was heavy, almost like someone was waiting for something. I eventually forced myself to go into my tent, leaving the fire burning low outside. I tried to sleep, but every little sound had me wide awake, staring at the top of my tent. Then I heard it, a soft crunching sound, like footsteps, getting closer. My heart was racing, and I grabbed my flashlight, unzipping the tent as quietly as I could. The fire was nearly out, but I could still make out shadows moving at the edge of the trees. There were more than one. I froze, trying to tell myself it was just animals. But then one of the shadows stepped forward, and I saw it wasn't an animal at all. It was a person, standing there, just watching me. No movement, no sound, just watching. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I grabbed what I could, left most of my stuff behind, and started hiking out of there in the dark. I didn't stop until I reached the road hours later, completely worn out and shaken. I never told anyone. I didn't know what to say, but late at night, when it's quiet, I still think about those footprints. I think about the people out there, watching me in the dark, walking around my camp while I slept. And I wonder if they followed me all the way to the road, watching me the whole time, waiting for me to stop. I decided to go on a solo camping trip to a quiet mountain area I had been to when I was a kid. I remembered how beautiful the views were and how peaceful the forest felt, so I packed my gear and set off. The road to the campsite was bumpy, with deep holes and loose rocks. I parked my truck at the start of the trail and began my hike into the woods, feeling both excited and a little nervous. The sun was high in the sky as I walked, shining through the branches above me. I loved the sounds of nature, the rustling leaves, the chirping birds, and the gentle flow of a creek in the distance. After a few hours, I found a great spot next to a small stream where I could set up my tent. I took my gear out, collected firewood, and lit a small fire as the sun began to set behind the mountains. As the sky turned dark, I sat by the fire, roasting marshmallows and listening to the wood crackle. The warmth wrapped around me, but as the night grew colder, an uneasy feeling crept in. The forest was quiet now. The usual night sounds had faded into a strange silence. I told myself it was nothing and tried to push the feeling away. But then I heard it, a soft rustling noise coming from the trees. I froze, straining to listen. The sound stopped, then started again, closer this time. My heart raced. Maybe it was just a deer or a raccoon. I tried to convince myself, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I decided to go to bed early, crawling into my sleeping bag inside the tent. I thought about the long hike ahead of me in the morning, but sleep wouldn't come. Every little noise from the tent or a snap of a twig outside made me jump. Eventually, I got so tired that I drifted off into a restless sleep. In the early hours of the morning, I woke up to a sound that sent chills down my spine. It was a low, deep growl echoing in the stillness of the night. My heart raced as I lay still, breathing shallowly. The growl came again, closer this time, followed by a heavy thud, like something large was moving through the bushes. I forced myself to stay quiet, hoping whatever it was would just go away. But it didn't. I could hear it sniffing around my tent, its breath heavy and labored. The darkness felt thick and suffocating. I grabbed my flashlight and quietly unzipped the tent, my hands shaking. I shone the light outside, revealing only shadows and trees. The growling stopped. I hesitated but slowly crawled out of the tent. The moonlight lit up the clearing, and I could see large, clawed footprints in the dirt, fresh and unmistakable. Panic gripped me hard. I knew I had to leave quickly. I hurriedly packed my things, my heart racing as I moved. Every little sound in the trees made me jump. As I zipped up the last bag, I heard the growl again, this time louder and more menacing. I didn't think twice. I grabbed my backpack and ran, feeling the cool night air on my face. I didn't look back as I sprinted down the trail, adrenaline driving me faster. The hike back felt endless in the dark, my legs burning with each step. I heard branches snapping behind me and the heavy thud of something chasing me. I pushed myself harder, desperate to reach my truck. The growling echoed in my ears, a haunting sound that urged me to move faster. Finally, I caught a glimpse of my truck's headlights shining through the trees. When I reached it, I jumped inside, fumbling with my keys as I locked the doors. My hands were shaking, and my breath came in quick gasps. I started the engine and sped away, gravel flying under my tires. As I drove away, the growling faded into the distance, replaced by the frantic beat of my heart. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been out there was still watching me, hidden in the darkness. I realized how close I had come to a danger I couldn't understand, an encounter with nature that reminded me how wild and unpredictable it could be. Months passed, but I couldn't forget that night. I stayed away from the mountains, haunted by the thought of what had followed me. I'd read stories about bears and cougars, but the noise I heard was different. It felt like something worse, something that knew how to hide and wait. I learned that even the most beautiful places could hold threats we can't see. The memory of that night lingered, a chilling reminder that nature isn't always friendly. Every time I saw the mountains in the distance, I remembered the fear that gripped me as I ran for my life. Some adventures, I realized, should stay in the past, because some things that lurk in the shadows are best left undisturbed.